speakers up to the stage. And I think we're open for discussions from the audience. Yes. Yeah, sorry, one thing also for the people who are viewing it on the web, we have these very interesting cube-like microphones, which you can enjoy passing to one another, but...
Okay. So my name is William Gunn. Some of you may know I started this thing called the Reproducibility Initiative. And it's always interesting for me when I hear somebody from the NIH say, we need to stop doing these underpowered studies. Because what I was hearing was we had a really hard time convincing the NIH and other funding agencies they need to stop funding underpowered studies. So, I mean, which do you want more of? Do you want fewer, more highly powered studies? Or do you want a bunch of smaller ones in some way to do meta-analysis? Like, what is the plan here?
So this is a work in progress. We certainly don't think the current state of affairs is particularly good. And there's actually an interesting theoretical discussion about whether what you want is a very small number of highly powered studies or whether it may be preferable to have a moderate number of moderately powered studies, but you do it in such a way that the data can be easily combined. That obviously requires some active transport in order for that to happen. But for sure, the direction that we would want to move in is a state in which we are actually doing fewer experiments, but the experiments themselves are more highly powered. One area where I think we're making some positive steps is in clinical trials. And a number of the institutes now have taken a much more aggressive stance on how they pick their clinical trials because it's not a good idea to fund an underpowered clinical trial. We are now requiring that when people submit clinical trial applications, they actually have to submit an attachment, which is a statistical plan. The reason why we're doing that is that we're drawing attention to it. We're drawing attention to it for the applicants to say, we really care about what's in here. And we also care about it for the reviewers. We've also taken some steps to put some resources up on our website about how to calculate sample sizes for different kinds of studies. One kind of study where sample sizes are almost always calculated incorrectly are cluster randomized trials or group treatment randomized trials. And so we actually have put a bunch of resources up there so that are freely available to the entire scientific community. And we're hoping that what this will do is that people will use it and will submit better quality applications.
This is for Aaron. So I love your talk. Thank you. So I agree with everything you said. But the challenge here is in the implementation, right? I mean, as you point out, these ideas have been around for a long time. I mean, Harold, 20 years ago put this forward at the NIH, and it never went anywhere, partly because it met resistance in the community, which I think is probably the community is more ready for this now than they were 20 years ago. But really, the problem has always been, how do you do this? How do we get something like this started, given that we have a world in which everything is dependent on, where you publish, and we can't just snap our fingers and make that true. So I just kind of love to hear what you think about the practical realities of getting this off the ground.
Yeah, I wish I had the answer to this. I think you probably know at least about as much about this as I do. My thinking is that, I think there are probably many ways one could go about this, but the two we sort of have in mind are to do experiments with the 4 sort of changes to the process that I mentioned. Those experiments could go on at different journals, and the hope would be that you would gather some momentum through those experiences. Honestly, I don't think that would be enough. I think another approach that also is likely to be difficult, but I think has a better chance of working, is to convince, if it were possible, to convince or entice through other means, a journal with a good reputation to convert to the type of model, don't go there, that I've described, I think that could really start the ball rolling, because then you could, I think it would be easier to get some other journals to follow suit, particularly those that are, there are some that are, I think, experiencing serious financial constraints due to the proliferation of journals, open access, high fee journals. Yeah. So I'm currently enamored of an approach, if it were possible, to convince an existing journal to convert to this type of model and then move from there. I think that might start. It won't happen. Even that wouldn't catalyze change overnight, but I think that could have some substantial, gather some substantial momentum.
Or 1, 2, 3.
So I have a short comment and a short question, one for you and the questions for all of you. So there's some really interesting work that Dan is here, Dan Whaley is doing with Hypothesis and ELUC, which is, I think, really interesting to think about ways of changing when and how peer review happens using annotations. So I think that's something that's definitely look at it as a potential opportunity for a model for intervention. What I'm interested in is what we're talking about this meeting is largely peer review and publications. And we have 3 people on the stage, all of whom published and are published scientists, but also work at funding organizations. And I'm really interested, particularly for you, Jeremy, kind of your thoughts of having worked at NIH, right? And now sitting at the helm at Science Magazine, what your feeling is, but also you, Aaron, and you, Mike, the balance between the importance of peer review for grant applications and peer review and publications, and should we be talking a little bit more about the importance of peer review? I mean, part of what you said, how do we think about ensuring that the grants that are coming in are proposing effective research? But what is the interplay there, and what is your thought about peer review in grant review, and should some of the things we're talking about here in publication also be thought about in the context of peer review for grants?
So I think, in some ways I think there's similarities, but there are also some substantial differences. When the peer review assessment that I was involved in, one of the big issues that we talked about a lot at the beginning was the question of audience. Is the purpose of peer review to inform program officers and institute directors about the qualities of proposals and what they should to fund, or is it to provide feedback to the scientists about the quality of their application so they can improve it? And the decision was, through this whole process, it was the former and not the latter. And that drove a lot of policy discussions. And the community, I think, was very split about, including peer reviewers, about whether that was the right answer. So they're frustrated that, you submit a proposal, you get feedback, and then you address the criticisms, and it goes to different reviewers who pick on you for something else entirely, and so on and so forth. I mean, it all. So I think keeping the audience in mind is really important, and what you're trying to achieve with peer review. I highlighted one of the other issues, which is, identifying and recruiting the right reviewers, which I think is certainly a common theme which NIH struggles with, and journals do as well. I think the other issue, which Aaron touched about a little bit, is sort of training, and I would add to evaluation for peer reviewers. So, that was something that I worked on when I was at NIH and failed completely to get any traction on, was putting in some system whereby members of study sections could get feedback about whether they were doing a good job or not. And the proposal that I was working on at the time was having program officers provide some sort of evaluation, because they're the customers and they don't have as big a vested interest in the whole thing as an applicant does, to say, this review was really helpful, or this review was, did not help me make make my decisions any easier. So I think that's something to to think about in this whole process is how can we make peer review better by training peer reviewers and by evaluating the quality of the peer review so that people, I think a lot of peer reviewers don't know whether they're doing a good job or not. And they're, certainly we do, internally, we certainly evaluate our reviewers so that other editors can see which reviewers are good, although even that could be much, much finer because it's, some of it is timeliness, some of it is, clarity in their comments and so on. You get a whole range of things from some big picture comments or, 47, that's all, every scientist has seen this, 47 grammatical corrections and no comment about whether the science was interesting or not.
There is a growing interest in the science of peer review and thinking of peer review as a subject which is worthy of rigorous scientific investigation. There's an annual Congress of Peer Review, or the Science of Peer Review, which Drummond Rennie hosts in Chicago. It's very interesting. The evidence that suggests that peer review is effective for improving grant applications is basically non-existent. There was a Cochrane review that was conducted a number of years ago, which tried to answer the question as to whether or not peer review leads to better quality science, and concluded that there was no evidence that suggested that's actually the case. There have been a number of studies that have been done that have looked at the relationship between peer review scores and grant productivity, and either there is no association or the association is weak with a huge amount of noise. I think one of the problems is that in grant peer review, what we're asking, which is different from journal peer review, in grant peer review, we're asking reviewers to make a prediction. Predict for us whether or not this is a good idea, whether or not this is going to turn out well. There's a whole literature on prediction, shows that experts generally tend to be wrong or are no better than I guess chimpanzees throwing a dart. In fact, there's real literature, strong literature, suggesting that the more convinced an expert is that he or she is right, the more likely it is that they are wrong. And think about study sections and think about the very extroverted people in study sections who scream very loudly. And they may be just as smart, but they're also more likely to be wrong. I think, one thing that's interesting is that where experts do well, and there is science behind this, is experts do a better job of describing track record and describing impact. And that's part of the idea of the R35, the NEURA program, or maybe you might say the intramural program at NIH, which is that peer reviewers may be more effective in providing good quality advice if they're looking at past performance or current performance as opposed to trying to predict what's going to happen with a future study. But I think that one thing that is encouraging is that a number of people, a number of thought leaders are fostering a culture of the science of peer review, and that's something that we should very much support.
This is starting mostly as a comment on the first talk, Erin O'Shea's, and also the previous question. I'd like to flag up how incredibly selected scientists are at the moment, and how total an effect that has on pretty much everything they're going to say in this meeting. The 20% selection rate in any grant round, or less for faculty hiring and so forth.
I wish it was that good.
So the most important thing when you're talking about whether or not we will succeed if we make peer review public, will be if we make the peer reviewers think that they join the 10% by being public. So we will fail, I think, if we fixate on how much better it would be if everyone pulls together, unless we also fixate on how to make sure that you can't get an advantage by subverting things. So I particularly think this for when we're talking about how much better it would be if named publications were not used. The people in my group and the neighboring ones believe, wrongly I think, that their careers depend on, and that if they don't publish in the very best journal, then someone else will sneak into the top 10% ahead of them. So the devil is not just making a better world, but persuading people that there is no tiny advantage to be got by doing it. We'll succeed if we can do that. Now, a really good thing I can finish on this comment is that actually in the past couple of years, preprints have done that. So we plainly can do it, but it's going to be terribly important to work on working on that little negative.
Yeah, this is for Aaron. I mean, I think this is just wonderful. I love your vision. And I think there are many visions in this room. And us in this room, we could probably all agree on them. But I'm slightly worried about the premise. And I'm worried that we've got some of the premises wrong. And the one I want to flag is the one where you said all scientists care about their reputation. I'm sure that's true for everyone here, but I'm not sure it's globally true. Or even if it's globally true, then reputation is so differently defined. You know, if what you said were true, then people would not publish in these crap vanity journals and pay for it. So reputation is very different. You know, I've published a paper in an impact factor 0.001 and I've paid $5,000 for it. It's just, so we've got to keep that in mind. And I think that really matters in the next couple of days when we discuss this. What we discuss here has to apply not only to us in this room who share extremely high standards and who share the visions we're talking about. It has to apply to everyone. Otherwise, it's going to go pear-shaped immediately. I'm sort of
I think that
bad
point,
to
that
start
point is
with this
well
kind of-
taken, and I think it's an overstatement to say that all scientists care about their reputation. You're right. I think, though, the majority of scientists do care about their reputation. And I'm not sure that we can, I mean, while we have to be cognizant of the fact that there are some that don't, I think the fact that, I mean, I believe most do, and that will help drive people to exhibit the correct behavior. It won't drive all of them. You're absolutely right.
I think we have to work on that belief.
Yes.
Otherwise, we can shoot ourselves
Yes.
in the head. But we have to remember the whole slew of others. I mean, laws are not made for good people.
Yes.
Laws are made for the others.
It's a very good point. And other cultures have very different incentive systems and values like you're talking about. You're absolutely right. Yes. I think
and we've
that's,
got to keep that
it is
in
a
mind as
fair
we go
point.
through the discussion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm looking through the lens of a very, yes, a fraction of the scientific community. Yes.
I think the other incentive, I mean, scientists care about their reputation, everything else being equal. So if there, you know, if there are other factors, if it's a question of a hit to your reputation and an increased chance of getting funding,
Right.
you know, you think about it, or something.
We have some questions from the online audience.
Yes, hi. The online audience first has a request that if you don't mind, if you ask a question, could you identify yourself before asking it? And then we do have a question for Aaron from Olivo at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, who says, it's paradoxical that we are having this great discussion on open peer review about a week after NCBI announced the closure of PubMed Commons due to lack of use, which is disappointing given that it was a very functional and visible interface for commenting. Why do you think it did not take off, and how can we stimulate people to perform post-publication peer review? And P.S., you gave a great talk.
Okay, well, thank you for that comment. And I'm afraid, I'm not sure I have a good answer to that question. It's a very good question. I mean, I certainly can't answer why it didn't take on, but I think the real underlying motivation is what can we do to encourage post-publication evaluation and to motivate people to participate in that process? I think that's an important issue, and I don't have a simple answer to that. I mean, maybe Bodo, do you have some thoughts? Get the square thing. Boyan will throw it at you. Right? How to motivate people to participate in post-publication evaluation.
I don't have,
I want to do. I've got a second question. Mike goes first, of course.
I mean, I've thought a lot about the public comments thing, and I love public comments, but this is relevant to all our conversations. There's a, right now, we live in a world where the only evaluations that matter are the ones that take place leading to peer
I
review.
think that's fair.
Right?
That's
And
totally
so
fair.
why,
Yeah.
people don't participate.
Why bother?
Yeah, they don't participate
Yeah.
in something like that
Yeah.
because it has two phenomena. First of all, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You don't know that anyone's ever going to look at these comments. And then what's more, everybody could look at those comments for all of eternity, or turns out not so, but that this superposition of having of things you write on post-publication peer review, having simultaneously no audience and an infinite audience and no value to any clear part of the scientific community means it's always going to be underutilized and niche. It's always going to be something you
Yes.
only do if you have some
Yes.
really strong motivation to do it, or you've got something. The PubMed Commons was destined to fail because we don't have the culture around those kind of things. So people shouldn't look at it, and I don't think it was a failure, but should look at the fact that it wasn't adopted as any kind of statement about people's interest in or the value in post-publication peer review. It's just in the current context, we can't get people to use it. So that's why I think we really have to focus, as you said, on this culture. It's a catch-22. Until these things start mattering, people won't participate. So we have to figure out how to grease the wheels in such a way that we get people to do it before it matters, so we can show people how.
I totally agree. That's the right answer.
Sorry, I should say my name.
Yeah.
I'm Michael Eisen. I'm from
Yep.
UC Berkeley and HHMI.
Okay. Maria Lepton, Embo, Heidelberg. This one's for Mike. And again, I'm going to be a real wet towel. And I want to comment on your question, will transparent peer review clarify, enhance statistical quality? Beautiful vision, beautiful belief in our ability to do things right. And I think, again, it matters for what we're going to do in the next couple of days. Transparent peer review would be fantastic if everybody had the ability to do statistics like you do. And, you know, EMBO journals do transparent peer review. Things slip through. Just look at all the plots. Just look at all the figures, not only at EMBO journals, of course, elsewhere, that go through peer review. People look at these things, and not everybody is able to spot these things. Some people will not see that this embryo looks the same as this, and this band looks the same as this. I'm not good at evaluating statistics. So I think it needs professionals. It needs professionals, and not everybody is equally professional doing these things. And I think that's something we may want to look at in the next couple of days when we look at assessing and, you know, what's the level of quality control and of professional quality control that's needed, quite apart from everything else that happens in peer review. I think we need to keep that in mind too.
That's terrific.
I should say we've had a lot of enthusiastic conversations and actions with statistical societies who are eager, and we have a board of statistical reviewers for science and other similar things for other journals, and there are subsets of those societies that are eager to be involved in.
I think it really needs to be that professional.
Yeah, so, right, so. So, okay, so that really is spot on, and so let me just take this. So the very prominent, and I would say wealthy, clinical journals, like New England, like JAMA, like Annals, do have professionals. They have full-time statisticians who, this is what they do for a living. Now, they don't ref every single paper because that's impossible. So the idea is that you might, let's say you get 100 papers, you might say that 20 of these are potentially interesting, 10 will be the number that you'll accept. So the 20 that are potentially interesting based on the first round of content peer review, they then get looked at by statistical reviewers. Now, if we get to an era where we're actually sharing data, then we can take this to an even higher level, because then professional statistical reviewers can actually look at the data, look at the code, and by looking at the code, that actually gives you a very good sense as to how careful the scientist actually is, how well annotated is the code, and that can help them make a good judgment as to whether or not this is a solid piece of work. So I think that your comment is absolutely spot on. This does require professionals, and this requires resources, and it requires a great deal of thought. Yeah.
Oh, okay, over here. So Jody Rosenblatt from Huntsman Cancer Institute at the University of Utah, and I just want to say it's really admirable and exciting what you're trying to do with peer review. So I congratulate you, and I feel privileged to be a part of it. I just wanted to talk about reproducibility, and I think it especially is pertinent to cancer research because that has been a problem, I know, heavily. And I think it's tied up with model systems, but maybe also a lack of knowledge of statistics in general. So things have been going increasingly to mice, which we cured cancer in mice millions of times, not so much in the humans. And I think this is expensive. And when I went through, trying to get my IACUC approved to do mice studies, I was shocked at how few mice I needed in their power calculations. And also my friends had passed flavorants through the FDA with 3 mice alone that was going to human ingestion. It's a bit scary to me. So I guess one of my concerns is this really a good model system? One thing. And then the other problem is I haven't been trained in this kind of level. I've been doing biochemistry forever. I see clear things. It's black and white. Now you're going into statistical knowledge, genome science, and, mice, where I don't think the calculations seem enough compared to what I'm used to. I just wonder if you can comment a little bit on where that's going in terms of model systems and teaching statistics.
So there is, I think that this is a very important question. And so one question is whether or not the biology is such that the model system is appropriate. But even putting that aside, if the study is underpowered or improperly designed, there are all kinds of other statistical pitfalls you can fall into. Like, for example, you have litter mates. And the problem with litter mates is that they're not independent observations. Normally, when we do a typical data analysis, we assume that all the observations are independent of one another. If they're litter mates or they're cage mates, they're not independent of one another. So there are ways of dealing with that, but you have to know. So I think one critical part, I was involved a long time ago with, I believe it was an HHMI project when I was at Cleveland Clinic, to introduce elements of experimental design into graduate education. And they asked people with my phenotype to teach this. And the idea is that there are certain aspects of experimental design and data and analytics that we had a better handle on than other communities. And we're not going to teach a grad student or a postdoc to be an expert statistician. But what we do want to teach them is that, number one, they should know that these problems actually exist, and they need to ask the questions. If you don't know that that litter mates or cage mates creates a situation where you don't have independent observations and that decreases the power of your study, you'll never ask. So the key thing is to teach people that these problems exist, so that way they then go to an appropriate expert, and so that might be a professional statistician within their university to help them think through their experiment. It also conveys a message. We sometimes joke about this, and there's a rather nasty cartoon that shows the applicant going to the statistician one day before the grant is due and says, "I have 10 mice, is that enough? And I need to know by tomorrow because my grant is due tomorrow." And what the statistician wants to do is say, "Tell me about your study, what's your experiment, what you're trying to study, and let me help you design it." And maybe by increasing the level of awareness at all levels, not just grad students and postdocs, but at all levels of science, what we'll do is we'll bring in people with expertise in analytics into experimental design earlier on.
Just to follow up with that, I think we were at the same statistical meeting speaking in the panel together.
That's right.
And there was this discussion was taking place, and a statistician said, that a typical conversation is somebody comes and says, you know, this is what I can afford. Can you write me a justification for why this is enough? And so I think there's a conflict of interest between the statistician employed by the same university who is also interested in you getting a grant, you know, corrupting the statistical analysis of it. But again, I, you know,
Other-
So I just want to say that, getting close to 9, but Mark, you start here on, asking questions, not necessarily, this is a great start to the meeting, so there's lots of time for this discussion.
So,
You have a cue.
okay, great. So I'm Jody Nanari from UC Davis. I wear a couple different hats. I'm president of the AICB. I'm also editor-in-chief at the Journal of Cell Biology. So I think I have some, I don't know, expertise about peer review and the benefits of it and the benefits of journals, really. But I think Aaron did an outstanding job of really highlighting the problems in the publishing process. But I think that there, you know, are multiple solutions to each one of those problems. And I think we have to consider unintended consequences of some of the solutions that have been suggested. And in one in particular that I would like to focus on, which I think is the major one that makes people really negative about peer review, is the idea that the journals themselves somehow impart the significance of the research that we do in our labs to the community. I think that's a huge problem. And it's associated with cell nature science, right? Those kind of things. But the solution that Aaron posited would transfer then the significance onto the investigator. And I think here it's a problem because investigators are linked to institutions like Harvard and MIT and Caltech, and those have associated prestige. You know, people have names in a field, and there's a certain elitism to what we do in science. And so I'd like to bring it back to the impact factor, which is so flawed. And the people in the audience from the NIH, who at some point came up with, I thought, a brilliant solution to this problem, which is not individual investigator based, it's not journal based, but it's based on the work itself and how it fits into the field. And I think the term was, John, what was it? Relative?
RCR.
Yes.
RCR, yeah.
I loved this idea.
Yeah.
What happened to it? And why is not that a better solution to that particular problem in the publishing process? So I'm just opening that up to Aaron.
I think our idea is that could be one of the tags. It absolutely is a good metric. But I think leaving the journal, for all the reasons I said, the journal name in place is problematic. And I do believe that scientific work should be evaluated on an article, on a piece of work basis, not on anything else.
Not on an individual basis.
And
so
not
the
on the
decision
person.
to self,
This is on the
right.
work.
But the decision to self-publish puts the spotlight on the investigator themselves. And I don't think that's where it belongs.
I guess I'm not sure how the decision to publish puts the spotlight on the investigator themselves. Always the investigator is responsible for that body of work. Always. You have ownership over the work. And whether you're a new person or a senior person, or I actually think that part levels the playing field. I would argue right now that the playing field is tilted towards those of us who have some highly established reputation, making it easier for our papers to get into those journals.
I'm
So, you
not
know,
sure
and
about that.
leveling the field means that a young person can publish a paper.
Hi. So I'm Erica Shugart. I'm CEO of AICB. And I guess it's been interesting as I've been thinking about coming in to think about this problem is what is the problem we're trying to solve? I know that we're here to talk about peer review, but we've described a lot of problems. It's the hyper-competition. It's a certain type of peer review. A lot of the peer review we've talked about as being an issue is the one that's the gatekeeper combined with peer review, it seems like. And I do wonder if there are exemplars in the community already where peer review is working well. And I do, I wonder if we could, as we think about it, think about where are those places, and I would put the plug in for Society Journals being maybe one of those places where, maybe it's not as broken. We don't want to go in the assumption that it's broken everywhere. I mean, I do wonder about that and just concerned that if we put in new systems, it's like maybe we should try to bolster systems that are already maybe working better than some of the others. And I wonder about just whether peer review in all the journals is an umbrella topic, or if there's sort of different places where there are issues and problems that add to the group.
I don't think, at least I wasn't trying to say peer review is broken. In fact, I don't think peer review is broken. And I think there are many places where peer review works exceptionally well. Society Journals is perhaps one example. eLife is certainly another example. But many journals, including the ones we keep, Cell, Nature, and Science, peer review there can also work very well. So I don't really think that's the issue. So the issues are those that to me, all of us may have slightly different sort of opinions about what the most important issues are. But for me, the issues are those that I laid out concerning, the corrupt incentive system that comes from using proxies for quality. That is, to me, actually, that is one of the very biggest problems in the system today. And it drives a lot of bad behavior that we don't want. It's also a lot of wasted resources. Science moves slower because research isn't available immediately. Those are big problems. And yes, the lack of transparency, I think, is a problem. In my opinion, science and in my even experience, like Ron was talking about, when I was coming up, through the ranks in science, and even now, peer review to me is to improve the quality of the science. It's to get feedback from your experts, from colleagues who can give a critical evaluation of the work that allows you to improve the science. To me, that is the purpose of peer review. Editorial decision and what to include somewhere is a separate issue. But improving the science and making sure that science is quality and has the right statistical analysis and that's the purpose of peer review. And it's twisted into something else. It's adversarial in many cases. It convolutes this issue of, is the paper sexy enough for my journal, and is it right? Sometimes they care less about whether it's right. It's more about, and that to me is perverted. It's perverts science. And science should be, peer review should be about improving the work. And then the work, in my opinion, should be disseminated. And not evaluated like it's not good enough for this journal. And it's only not good enough because they think it's not important enough in some respect. And now we're going to start all over again and waste a whole bunch of time and money. That's just crazy, in my opinion. It's crazy. So I think this is really an issue. So it's not that peer review is broken. That's not. I don't believe that. I mean, others may have a different opinion.
So I think the overarching interest is that the science that our system is producing is science that's believable, that it is likely to be true, and that by virtue of it's likely to be true, that it leads to an advancement in science and an advancement in health and wealth. The fact that we have so much science that is not believable, that is not reproducible, suggests that the system is not working well. One of the possible problems, and the science that has been done on peer review, and this is a field which is growing, but the science that has been done has produced very little evidence that peer review improves the quality of science. That evidence just isn't there. Part of it may be because it hasn't been studied enough. One of the problems I think with peer review, and this is not my own original idea, people have actually studied this and have looked at this in a quantitative way, is that peer review is itself is a small sample size problem. So at NIH, a typical grant is reviewed by 3 people. That's a sample size of 3. And based on a sample size of 3, we are making a decision about how to spend $2 million. That, arguably, some people have said that that makes absolutely no sense. There's been some work done to suggest that the optimal number of peer reviewers that you need is at least 6 or 7 to be able to come up with a robust conclusion. There's been some interesting work that's been done where people review their competitors' applications. So let's say you have an assembly of 100 applications. Each person will review 10 applications of their competitors. And the result is that each application actually gets more reviews. And there's been some data that suggests that that leads to an improvement in peer review. But the overriding issue is that we need to produce a much greater proportion of science that is believable. Right now, a lot of science that's produced is really of very poor quality, and that reflects badly on the whole system, and peer review is part of it.
I'll try to make my question brief. Randy Sheckman, UC Berkeley, eLife. So this is an amazing beginning to a challenging meeting with a lot of different points of view. And what I'd like to go back to Erin's talk, which was really fantastic. She has set the stage for some major changes that we should all consider. And I'd like to just focus on the very first one, which you highlighted, to improve the transparency of the review process with a very simple suggestion, namely that the reviews be posted on all published papers. Now, it turns out, if you've read the essay that she and Bodo wrote, it's only something like 2% of the biomedical journals that do this. And so since we have many journal editors represented here this evening, I'd just like to turn the question around to you, which is, what are the disincentives that prevent you as journal editors from posting the reviews on your papers? Why don't we see more journals doing this? It's been around for quite a long time. What's the problem? Why not do that? Editor of Science, for instance.
No, I mean, I think this is the whole purpose of it. We started very strong there.
Good. I mean, the short answer is, you know, we have asked in a limited sense reviewers about that question, and the responses from the reviewers that we use is very mixed and includes a number of people who say, if you do that, I won't review it.
I mean, even if they haven't identified themselves as referees, they don't want their comments posted.
I'd have to check more carefully to see what the question.
Of course, I know that people are reluctant.
Right.
We do this, and we give reviewers the option of having their identity shared. But I don't think, ever had an experience where a reviewer says, if you're going to post my response, I won't review the paper. So I find it. Yeah.
1% of referees, I would say, or even less nowadays, because it's so established, would have issues with anonymous posting of comments. Open peer review is, of course, a bit more sensitive.
I do want to say that question that you were being posed every breakout session. So you're going to get specific responses during the discussion to that very important question. So, I mean, I think it's a critical question. And, yeah, I mean, today was a big overview, so we covered a lot of topics. Tomorrow, we are going to drill down in a lot more granularity and very specific questions. So, but I want to thank this guy, but first of all, thank all of the speakers for getting
Just a few announcements. As you know, the session on Friday is participant-driven, and we are very fortunate to have more proposals and more ideas than we have rooms. And therefore, we need to gauge interest in these breakout sessions for our unconference on Friday in order to prioritize and assign rooms accordingly. So if you would please go to the website, it's at asapbio.org/peer-review. All the way at the bottom, there's a link to a Google Doc. If you can sign up with your name under the unconference sessions that you find interesting, we'll use that information to make decisions on how to prioritize them. These are non-binding. You can sign up for more than one, and we're going to call a break in the middle so that you can attend two if you want. Furthermore, there's now a social in the Pilot Lounge, and for those of you staying in the hotel, there's going to be shuttles departing now on a continuous loop until 11:15. So don't miss the last bus at 11:15 p.m. They're going to resume tomorrow morning at 6:45 a.m. until 8 a.m. So breakfast is at 7 in the dining room, but the agenda begins at 8:30 a.m. And finally, if you are departing on Friday and you have not yet arranged your transportation from HHMI, please check in at Conference Services. So I'm looking forward to continuing these fantastic discussions at the Pilot Lounge. Thank you.